You've been in this for what, 5 years, and you still don't get it? The young Marine sneered as he glanced at the patch on the old veteran's uniform. Sergeant Thompson, the battle-worn man, just stood there silently, his eyes unfazed by the words that were meant to cut him down. It wasn't the first time he'd been mocked for his patch, but today, something would be different. The group of young Marines, barely out of their teenage years, surrounded him, laughing, pointing, and mimicking the faded symbol on his shoulder, a symbol that had witnessed wars, losses, and victories long before any of them were born. To them, it was just a patch, a piece of cloth from a time long past. To him, it was everything. He had earned that patch through blood, sweat, and years of service that none of these young men could possibly understand. They saw it as old, outdated, and meaningless. But then, from across the barracks, came the sound of boots marching, the rhythmic step that every soldier knew but feared, the Admiral. As the group of Marines saw the commanding figure approach, their laughter died down, replaced with silence. The Admiral's sharp eyes scanned the scene with calm authority. He didn't speak right away, but his presence alone was enough to stop anyone in their tracks. The tension was palpable. The young Marines stood at attention, nervous, unsure of what would happen next. The Admiral, known for his no-nonsense approach, was a man who valued respect above all else, and right now, he was about to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The Marines, still unsure, tried to suppress their anxiety as the Admiral slowly walked over to Sergeant Thompson. Without a word, the Admiral extended his hand to the old veteran, who met his gesture with a firm handshake. The moment was brief but filled with silent understanding between two men who had seen the horrors of war and carried the weight of its memories. It was a moment that spoke volumes. The Marines could only watch as the Admiral turned to face them, his eyes narrowing. That patch you mock represents more than just a soldier's history. It represents sacrifice, loyalty, and the honor of those who came before you. If you ever doubt its value again, you'll answer to me. The Marines stood frozen, the words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. They had been taught to respect rank, to follow orders, but today, they were learning something far more important. It wasn't just about following orders, it was about understanding the history behind those who led before them. The Admiral's words hung in the air long after he had walked away, leaving the young Marines to reflect on their actions. The old veteran, who had silently endured their mockery, was now the embodiment of respect in their eyes. And that patch? It wasn't just a piece of fabric anymore. It was a symbol of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to earn the honor that comes with it. The respect for the veteran's patch had been earned, not by the Admiral's authority, but by the stories of bravery and sacrifice that had been shared in that one silent moment. As the young Marines left the barracks that day, they understood the lesson. They would carry that respect with them, not just for the veterans, but for the legacy of everyone who had ever worn that patch. The next morning, the young Marines sat in the mess hall, still reeling from the tension of the previous day. The silence between them was heavy, as if the events from the day before had cast a shadow over their usual chatter. For the first time, they were aware of the weight of the veteran's presence in the room. Sergeant Thompson, sitting alone at the corner, still wore his patch with quiet pride, his eyes distant, reflecting memories of wars fought long ago. He had seen the young men's mockery, and he had heard the way they spoke about the badge he wore. But yesterday had changed everything. The quiet authority of the Admiral had spoken louder than any words of defense ever could. For the first time, they saw the respect behind that patch, a symbol of sacrifices they could never truly understand but were beginning to appreciate. In the back of the room, Private Williams exchanged a glance with Private Carson, both of them now sitting in the uncomfortable silence they had never known before. Williams, once quick to laugh at the old veterans, now looked at Thompson with new eyes, his thoughts racing as he pondered the weight of the old man's service. Carson, who had been one of the loudest voices in the mockery the day before, felt a pang of guilt he couldn't shake off. He had been raised on tales of honor, but those tales had always seemed distant, like stories told around a campfire that were never meant to touch his reality. Now, those tales felt too real to ignore. As they ate, the young Marines noticed the absence of laughter. The energy in the room was different, quieter. They weren't just eating breakfast anymore. They were reflecting, processing. The colonel, who had been overseeing the breakfast, walked in, his gaze sharp and calculating. He was a man who had seen combat, and like the Admiral, he carried the weight of experience with him. He stood at the front, scanning the room for a moment before addressing the group. Yesterday was a reminder, he began, his voice firm but not unkind, of what it means to wear the uniform, of the history you represent. You are part of something far greater than yourselves, and you carry the responsibility of those who have served before you. The room was silent as the Marines listened, their eyes fixed on the colonel. Respect isn't just something you earn in battle, the colonel continued, his tone shifting slightly, it's something you show every day, in your actions, your words, and how you treat those who came before you. The message was clear. It wasn't just about respecting the patch. It was about understanding the stories that came with it, the sacrifices that had been made, and the honor that had been earned through years of service. As the colonel finished speaking, the young Marines exchanged glances, their thoughts swirling in a mixture of realization and newfound respect. They had been taught that respect came with rank, but now they understood that respect also came with history. The Admiral had silenced them with his presence, but the colonel had silenced them with his words. Today, they would carry that lesson with them, not just in their duties but in how they saw their fellow soldiers and the veterans who had paved the way before them. The following days after the colonel's speech, there was a change in the atmosphere around the barracks. The young Marines, who had once laughed and mocked, now walked with a sense of purpose and quiet respect. Sergeant Thompson noticed the shift. He had seen it all before, young soldiers. Coming and going, full of bravado and dismissive of the past. But this time, it felt different. The weight of the lesson seemed to be sinking in. During the morning drills, the young Marines worked harder, paying attention to the details that had once seemed insignificant. They were no longer rushing through their tasks, but instead, they were executing them with precision, the way veterans had taught them. Sergeant Thompson watched as Private Williams, who had once been the loudest critic of the veterans' patch, now carried himself with a newfound seriousness. He followed the orders with diligence, his eyes focused, and his posture straight. There was no more smirking or whispering behind backs. The change wasn't just in the work, though. It was in their interactions with one another. The camaraderie that had once been laced with teasing and mockery now felt more genuine. The jokes were still there, but they were different. They were the kind of jokes that only those who had earned respect from each other could make. They were no longer about belittling others, but about lifting each other up. Even the new recruits seemed to sense the shift in the air. The older Marines, those who had seen combat and earned their stripes, carried themselves with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. They didn't boast, they didn't need to. Their presence alone demanded respect. It wasn't until one afternoon, while the young Marines were cleaning their gear, that Private Carson approached Sergeant Thompson. Carson, the one who had been the most vocal about mocking the old veteran's patch, now stood before him, a look of genuine reflection on his face. "Sergeant, I wanted to apologize," Carson said, his voice steady but sincere. "I didn't get it before, but now I see why that patch means so much. I didn't know what you and the others had been through, and I was wrong to make fun of it. I'm sorry." Thompson, who had been cleaning his rifle, paused and looked at Carson. For a moment, the air was thick with the weight of the apology. Thompson's expression softened, and he placed a hand on the young Marine's shoulder. "Apology accepted," Thompson said quietly. "But it's not just about the patch, son. It's about understanding the sacrifices that come with it. You're learning that now, and that's what matters." Carson nodded, his eyes focused. For the first time, he understood. He understood the meaning behind the patch, behind the stories that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. It wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was a symbol of duty, of honor, and of the sacrifices that had been made. The young Marines didn't just walk with respect for their elders anymore, they stood with it. And that, Thompson knew, was the beginning of something far more important than they could realize. They were learning to carry not just the uniform, but the legacy of those who had worn it before them. The following week, things had changed. The young Marines, still adjusting to the weight of the lesson, were no longer the carefree group they once were. There was a newfound respect in the air, a shift in the way they looked at their trainers and the older Marines. Private Williams, who had once led the charge in mocking the veterans' patch, now took the time to listen during briefings, asking thoughtful questions and paying attention in ways he had not before. It wasn't just about learning drills or executing commands, it was about understanding the deeper purpose behind every task. Sergeant Thompson noticed the change, but he wasn't the type to comment on it. He simply carried on with his duties, guiding the new recruits with the same quiet professionalism that had earned him the respect of his fellow Marines. One afternoon, during a routine exercise, Thompson gathered the young Marines for a debrief. He could tell by the look in their eyes that they had finally begun to see the bigger picture. They weren't just following orders anymore, they were becoming part of something much greater than themselves. As the Marines stood in formation, Thompson addressed them with the same calm tone he always used, but this time, there was a subtle pride in his voice. "You've made progress," he began. "You've come a long way since you first arrived. But remember, this isn't about getting the job done, it's about doing it right. It's about understanding why you're doing it." Private Carson, who had been quiet for most of the training, spoke up. "Sergeant, I've been thinking about what you said, the patch, the sacrifice. I used to think it was just a symbol, but now I get it. It's more than that." Thompson nodded, his gaze steady as he locked eyes with the young Marine. "Good. That's what I wanted you to understand. The patch, the stories, the legacy, it's all part of who we are. It's about honor, duty, and remembering that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us." The young Marines stood a little taller now, as if they had shed the arrogance that had once defined them. They were no longer just recruits, they were becoming part of a legacy, one that would shape them long after their training was over. As the training continued, the Marines grew stronger, not just in physical endurance, but in character. They had begun to understand the weight of what it meant to serve, not just for themselves, but for the greater good, for the country they swore to protect. And while the lessons from the past may have been hard to accept at first, they had finally begun to sink in. The journey wasn't over, but they had learned something valuable. The true strength of a soldier lies not in how they perform in the field, but in how they carry the weight of the history and honor they are entrusted with. The next morning, the atmosphere on the base was different. It wasn't just the physical training that had become harder, it was the mental shift that had taken place. The young Marines were starting to realize the significance of their service, and the weight of the stories that surrounded them. Sergeant Thompson watched as his recruits filed into formation, each one standing taller, more focused. They had come a long way from the group of cocky, unsure individuals they had once been. It wasn't easy to see the transformation, but it was happening, and Thompson knew it was time to take them to the next level. "Today, we're going to test everything you've learned," Thompson announced. "But it won't be just about strength or speed. It will be about teamwork, discipline, and mental toughness. You will rely on each other, or you will fail." Private Williams, once the loudest in the group, now stood quietly, his posture corrected, his eyes scanning the field with a newfound awareness. Private Carson, who had always struggled to keep up, now ran with purpose, his eyes fixed on the goal. Thompson knew this was the moment that would define them, the moment they would either rise to the challenge or falter. As they began the exercise, the Marines were pushed to their limits. It was no longer just about following orders, it was about understanding why those orders were given. They had learned the importance of every detail, every movement, and every decision. The first few hours were grueling, but they began to work as a unit, each Marine watching the others' backs, ensuring no one was left behind. In the middle of the exercise, William stumbled, exhausted, but Carson was right there to help him up. It was a small moment, but it was a sign that they were finally getting it. "This is what it means to be a Marine," Thompson said as he watched the scene unfold. "It's not about being the fastest or the strongest. It's about pushing through, together." As the day wore on, the recruits grew more cohesive, their movements more synchronized, their resolve stronger. They weren't just learning how to be Marines, they were becoming Marines. The lessons from their past were no longer distant memories, they were now part of their identity, part of who they were becoming. Thompson felt a quiet pride in what he was witnessing. The transformation had been slow, but it had been steady. The young Marines were finally starting to understand the true meaning of service. They were becoming the men and women they needed to be, not just for themselves, but for each other, for the legacy they had inherited, and for the country they swore to protect. It wasn't just about the patch on their uniforms or the medals they might one day earn, it was about the honor, the duty, and the responsibility that came with being part of something greater than themselves. As the sun began to set on another day of training, the Marines stood in formation, no longer the same group that had first arrived at the base. They were stronger, more disciplined, and more aware of the significance of the work they were doing. Sergeant Thompson nodded to himself, knowing that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead, but that they were ready for it.